Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Today we are tackling something pretty universal, something I think we all think about. How to make the most of our time, you know, how to be more effective with our days.
It's a big one for sure, a perennial topic.
Yeah, and I know you've gone through all the listener-submitted sources on this one, so I'm
Mm.
excited to kind of see what we can pull out of this, what's useful, maybe even surprising when it comes to how we actually
Yeah.
spend those precious hours.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And, looking at the sources that you sent over, I think one of the biggest things that jumps out is this call to shift from, kind of just going through the motions with our time, letting the days happen to us,
Right.
to being much more active and intentional about how we decide where those hours go.
It is so easy to just get caught in that daily grind,
Hmm.
right? You work, you do your chores, maybe a little bit of scrolling on your phone, and suddenly the day's over. But one statistic that you pulled out for the material really struck me, and that's that the average person has roughly 4,000 weeks in their lifetime.
Wow.
And if you're 40 years old, well over half of those weeks are already gone.
Yeah.
That's a big wake-up call.
It definitely reframes things. And that's what we want to do in this deep dive. It's not about finding, the best to-do list app or the perfect calendar hack. It's about getting this whole new perspective on what really matters and how we invest this very finite resource of time.
Absolutely. And we are going to be looking at some pretty fascinating concepts,
Yeah.
including why time sometimes feels like it's speeding up,
Right.
the trap of putting things off until someday,
Oh, yeah.
the art of figuring out what really matters, and why those experiences we have, they often stick with us far longer than, that new phone or gadget or whatever you bought. So are you ready to dive in?
I am. Let's do it. Let's start with something that I found really intriguing in the sources you sent. And that's this idea of the time perception paradox.
Okay, I love this one. This is one of my favorites too. So explain this. I mean, how does this work?
Yeah, well, essentially what the research shows is that our brains don't actually track time like a stopwatch.
Right.
It's more about the richness of our experiences.
That's interesting.
Think back to when you were a kid. Remember how long summer holidays felt like they would just last forever?
Oh, absolutely. A week felt like a year.
Right. And now a week just vanishes. And one of the key reasons for this is novelty. When we're children, the world is just this constant stream of new experiences,
Right.
new sights, new sounds, new tastes, information flooding in. And your brain is working hard to process all of this. And so that creates this sensation of time stretching out.
Right.
One of the things that's really interesting here is the role of dopamine.
Oh, really?
When we have these new experiences, it triggers dopamine release. And dopamine is linked to how we perceive and remember time. So more novelty, more dopamine-richer memories, and the feeling that time has expanded.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's like when you're driving to a brand new destination, right? The journey feels so much longer because you're taking in all the unfamiliar surroundings. But then your daily commute, that just flies by in a blur.
Exactly, because your brain has already mapped that route. It's
Yeah.
not actively engaging with new information. So,
Yeah.
so one practical insight here for our listeners is to intentionally introduce new elements into your life to make time feel more expansive. And this doesn't have to be huge changes.
Right.
Even small acts of novelty can make a difference.
So I'm curious about this because, I mean, the sources are suggesting we shake up our routines consciously,
Hmm.
you know, like take a different route to the store, maybe try a new recipe, explore a different park, like just inject small doses of the unexpected into our week. Do you think that actually works?
I do. And what's insightful is how even seemingly minor changes like this can impact your perception of time. One of the sources mentions someone who took an impromptu salsa dancing class,
Oh, wow.
and they said their whole day felt stretched out,
Oh, that's interesting.
even though the class itself was just a couple of hours and they were kind of out of their element. It was the novelty that made those hours feel significant and that made their day feel longer. It's about creating these distinct memories that serve as kind of anchors in our perception of time.
Yeah, I like that. It's almost like you're creating more landmarks, in your memory of time.
Exactly.
Now, another concept that really resonated with me from the sources is this idea of the illusion of someday.
Ah, yes. That comfortable little promise we make to ourselves.
I'll get to it eventually, right?
Exactly. I'll learn that skill someday. I'll take that trick someday. I'll read that book someday.
Someday, but someday never seems to actually arrive.
One of the sources called Someday the comfy couch of procrastination.
I love that.
It gives you this feeling of ease, postponement,
Yeah.
but it really stops you from doing the things that would actually make you feel good and enrich your time.
Yeah, it's almost like you're waiting for all the traffic lights to turn green before you even start your journey. If you're waiting for the perfect moment, well, you might be waiting forever.
You might be.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, how often do you find yourself relying on the idea of someday?
All the time, more than I care to admit.
Well, the sources offer some concrete strategies to combat that.
Okay, good, because I need that.
The key is to replace that vague someday with a specific date. And it can be for the smallest task, you know?
So instead of thinking someday I'll get around to that project, I say, okay, I will dedicate 30 minutes to researching that project by Friday. Something like that.
Exactly. Make it tangible. And you know what's even better is to start today, even with a tiny step. The sources emphasize this idea of initial momentum. So you want to learn guitar, watch one YouTube tutorial today. You're thinking about improving your fitness, just take a 10-minute walk. These small actions can actually build a lot of momentum and kind of break that inertia of someday.
Because once you get that ball rolling, it's so much easier to keep it moving. Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit. The sources also spend a lot of time discussing the challenge of prioritizing our time amidst all these demands.
Yeah, it's a universal struggle, isn't it? Work, personal life, emails,
Yeah.
notifications. It can be hard to figure out what actually deserves our attention.
It really can.
Yeah.
And this is where I think the sources introduce this idea of the deathbed test, which I'll admit sounds kind of intense, but I think it's a very powerful perspective.
It is. It's a thought experiment, but it's clarifying. Imagine yourself at 90 years old looking back on your life. What moments, what experiences are going to stand out?
Right.
Will it be the extra hours you spent answering emails? Or will it be the time you invested in relationships and in doing things you love?
Wow, that really puts things in perspective. Makes you think about where your energy is going.
It does. And once you have a clearer sense of what your priorities are, the sources suggest a really practical framework, the top 3 priorities rule.
Okay, I like that.
So each day, you identify just the 3 most crucial tasks. And those become your anchors for how you spend your time and energy.
Okay, that does feel a little bit more manageable than this giant, overwhelming to-do list I always have.
Yeah.
And, on top of picking your top 3, a crucial aspect of prioritizing is also learning how to say no.
Oh, absolutely. To the things that don't align with those priorities.
Especially all those time wasters.
And the sources specifically talk about social media as a big one. It's so easy to just get sucked into that endless scroll, and before you know it, you've lost a good chunk of your day.
Oh, I know. It's like you pick up your phone, just check one thing, and then 30 minutes later, you're still scrolling.
Right. And all those distractions, they really fragment our focus, so it's hard to actually pay attention to the things that matter.
They do. So what are some strategies for managing those distractions?
Well, the first step is identifying your personal time wasters. What are your biggest culprits? Once you know what they are, you can start setting some limits.
Okay.
Even something as simple as turning off non-essential notifications can make a huge difference.
I can see that.
It's about taking back control of your attention.
Yeah, it really is. And the sources suggest that once you start to do that, you realize you have way more time than you thought for the things that you truly value. Which brings us to another theme, and that is the power of investing in experiences rather than just acquiring possessions.
This is a really key distinction. The idea that experiences tend to stay with us and enrich our lives in a much deeper way than material goods do.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. Like that expensive gadget that you were so excited to buy a while back.
Yeah.
How much joy does it give you now compared to, say, a really memorable trip you took with friends or family?
Right.
Which one do you still tell stories about?
Exactly. You know, one of the sources talked about an expensive handbag that's just sitting in a closet collecting dust versus a cooking class that somebody took with a loved one and the memory that they share. Experiences create stories and they become part of our personal narrative.
They do. And they also often involve, connecting with others,
Yeah.
learning something new, challenging ourselves, all these things that contribute to our well-being in a way that just owning more stuff doesn't.
Yeah, I love that. And it really highlights how time, when invested in experiences, it just yields this richness that tends to last.
It does.
Okay, so let's talk about another really interesting concept, and that's the value that we place on time versus money. This really got me thinking.
Yeah, it's a fascinating contrast.
Yeah.
We're often so diligent about saving money, tracking our expenses, but then we can be so careless with how we spend our time. We let hours slip away without really thinking about it.
The sources make this comparison, right? Like, we wouldn't just throw cash away.
Yeah.
But we often waste huge amounts of time on things that don't really matter.
Right. And
Yeah.
the key difference is that money is renewable, but time time is gone forever.
That's so true.
Mm.
And it makes time arguably even more valuable.
Absolutely.
Which brings us to this really interesting idea I found in the sources of time wealth.
Oh, yeah. Tell me more about that. So it's not just about your financial status. It's about how much control you have over your schedule, how you choose to allocate your time. So you could have someone making a ton of money but working 80-hour weeks. They have financial wealth, but they're time poor.
Yeah.
They don't have that freedom to decide how they spend their days.
I've definitely been there.
Right. Whereas someone with maybe a more modest income, but a lot of flexibility in their work arrangements, they might have much greater time wealth, allowing them to prioritize those experiences, relationships, things like that.
Yeah.
It really makes you think about the trade-offs.
Yeah. Yeah, it does. What kind of wealth are you pursuing? Is it just money, or are you trying to cultivate that sense of freedom and control over your time?
Exactly. It's that blank canvas idea that the sources talk about, right?
Yeah.
The more intentionally you use your time, the more fulfilling the picture you create.
That's a good metaphor.
Okay, so speaking of intentionality, let's talk about another concept that the sources really dive into, and that's the power of single tasking.
Yeah, this one I think challenges a lot of our assumptions about productivity. This idea that we have to multitask.
Yeah, I mean, we've almost been programmed to think that multitasking is this essential skill in our busy world.
Yeah.
But the sources make a really compelling argument that actually it often leads to more stress and less quality work.
Exactly. When we try to do too many things at once, our attention gets all fragmented and we end up being less effective overall. I mean, think about it. You try to cook dinner while answering emails and having a conversation at the same time. You end up with burnt food, half-finished emails, and you probably haven't really connected with the person you're talking to.
Oh, that's so me.
So often. Right. And the sources contrast this with the idea of focused single tasking, where you actually dedicate all your attention to just one task.
Okay.
And what happens is it becomes not only more efficient, but also more enjoyable, and you end up with better results and a greater sense of accomplishment. It's like savoring a meal versus just gobbling it down on the run.
I can see that. Okay, so this next idea, I have to admit, I was a little hesitant about it first, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. And that is the idea of keeping a time log, like literally tracking where our time is going.
Yeah. You know, the sources really emphasize this common gap between how we think we're spending our time and how we're actually spending our time.
Right.
It's like tracking your expenses. You know, you might be surprised by all those little things that add up.
Exactly.
And a time log can really shine a light on all these hidden patterns, those quick social media checks, the unnecessary interruptions, the tasks that aren't really serving our priorities.
Yeah. So the key takeaway here is that awareness is the first step to making positive changes. You can't fix what you don't see.
Right. And once you have that clear picture of how you're using your time, you can start to adjust things.
So the sources give an example of someone who realized they were spending like an hour a day on social media just scrolling.
Wow.
And by reducing that, they got back a significant amount of time for other things.
It's empowering to realize you have that control.
It really is.
Yeah.
Now, as we're talking about, being more productive and intentional with our time, one thing that the sources really emphasize is the importance of rest.
Yeah. We often neglect this one.
We do. But the sources really challenge this idea that rest is unproductive. They actually reframe it as a productivity enhancer.
Like recharging a device.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You wouldn't expect your phone to work properly on a low battery. And it's the same with us. Without enough rest, our energy levels just plummet. We get burnt out. We can't focus.
So how do we make sure we're getting enough rest?
Well, the sources actually suggest scheduling downtime into your day. Treat it like an important appointment. And that way you make sure it actually happens.
I think I need to do that. Put it in my calendar.
Right. And then finally, to make sure we're staying on track with our values and goals, the sources highlight the value of regular reflection.
So just taking a few minutes every day to think about how you spent your time.
Yeah. Did you do the things that really mattered to you? Or were you just kind of running on autopilot?
It's a good little check-in, a little course correction.
It is. Okay, and then one last concept before we wrap up. And that's the idea of time buffers.
Okay, I like this one. This is about having some breathing room in our schedule.
Exactly. The sources talk about how overscheduled days are like a bunch of dominoes. One little delay and the whole thing topples over. So these time buffers, they give us that flexibility, that space for spontaneity, for rest, for reflection.
And it's often in those unscheduled moments that the best things happen.
They do. So to sum it all up, the key message from these sources is that using your time wisely, it's not about cramming more in. It's about creating a life that is rich with meaning and experiences. It's about the quality of your time, not just the quantity.
And as we've gone through all these ideas, I'm curious what resonates most with you.
That's a good question. For me, it's this idea of time wealth that really stands out. It's not just about money. It's about having the freedom to spend your time in a way that aligns with your values.
That's powerful. And I think for our listeners, it would be interesting for them to think about what one small step they can take today to be more intentional with their time. Maybe it's breaking a routine or finally scheduling that someday task or just identifying those top 3 priorities for tomorrow
Exactly. Whatever it is, just take that first step.
towards a more time-rich and fulfilling life.
That's what it's all about.
Yeah.
All right, well, that's all the time we have for today.
Thanks for having me. This was great.
Of course. And thanks to everyone for listening to The Deep Dive.